All right, welcome to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks, and we have been talking about federalism, and we're going to continue that discussion today. Again, as I mentioned in the previous discussion, federalism kind of introduces the idea of a vertical check into our constitutional system. So if the federal government is doing something that state governments don't like, they have some capacity to resist. They can use the federal courts to sue the government. They can refuse to accept certain kinds of funding. They can do certain things to make it more difficult. And again, this reflects the commitment of the framers to a system of government and a system of politics, and to try and develop and nurture an approach to politics and governing norms that focuses on the idea of compromise and the achievement of something like consensus. Now, in government, you're never going to get 100% of people to agree to anything. But typically speaking, and what the framers' reasoning was, is that if you could get, majorities of both, of all factions to agree on something, then it was more likely to be wise and sound policy. Now, of course, the history of American government suggests that that's not always the case, but nevertheless, it's important to understand that federalism creates this environment that is supposed to channel politics into the center, okay? At the same time, however, politics very frequently creates significant obstacles to policies that are likely to be consensus issues. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday, there was a school shooting in Georgia at Appalachia High School, which is in Winder, Georgia. That's my home state. I actually know where that is. It's a small rural county that's due east of Atlanta. It's considered part of the metropolitan area, but it's a rural school district. Since 1999, there have been 416 school shootings. There's never been less than 5 school shootings in any given year. In 2002, that was the low water mark. School shootings have steadily risen over the 25 years since the shootings, the mass killings at Columbine High School. You've had horrible events like the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings in 2012, the Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shootings in 2018, the most recent, the Robb Elementary School shootings in Texas, in Uvalde, Texas, in 2022. There were 46 school shootings in 2022. Making that sort of the single year in which there were more school shootings than any other. Now, how do we know this? We know this because the Washington Post has taken it upon itself to, scan and study, news reports to compile those statistics. Why doesn't the government create those statistics? I'll tell you one reason. The Center for Disease Control is actually really good at tracking events because that's their job. They track the spread of disease in any particular, in particular regions and states. They are legislatively prohibited from keeping statistics on gun-related, violence and homicides. The FBI doesn't really track even police-involved shootings. They have like a database. But it's purely voluntary, and many counties and municipal police departments simply refuse to give them those statistics. So the government doesn't have a clear idea of how many school shootings there are at any particular point in time, and it took the Washington Post to compile this database. School shootings disproportionately affect black children. Largely because, again, in many instances, these school shootings are happening in lower income areas where, for whatever reason, younger people are able to get access to guns. The median age of a school shooter of these 416 events is 16 years old. School shooting incidents have risen steadily over the 25-year period. In this particular incident, the school shooter was 14 years old. He was known to the FBI as someone who had threatened a school shooting on social media up to a year ago. They were aware of this young man, and they interviewed his parents. His father reported that all they had were hunting rifles, and that the young man did not have access to them unsupervised. Nevertheless, this kid got on campus with what has been reported by police as an AR-15 style rifle. Now, what is an AR-15 style rifle? The original template for this kind of rifle is the Armalite rifle. It was patterned after the M16s of the Vietnam era. They're kind of an advance on that. They are, in simple terms, high-velocity semi-automatic rifles. They carry a magazine. You pop it in, and they fire rounds at in excess of 3,200 square feet per second. The fact that it's high velocity is what makes it so deadly, and why it is the weapon of choice of mass killers everywhere. Because when a bullet traveling in excess of 3,200 square feet a second hits a human body, it has a smashing effect. It doesn't just penetrate through the body. It destroys everything in its path. It blasts you, small entry wound, but huge exit wound. It is designed by the guy that created the rifle. It is designed as a battlefield weapon. It is designed to kill enemy soldiers. Whether you hit them in the leg, whether you hit them full in the body, whether you hit them in the head, it is a killing shot if you are hit with that kind of a weapon. And the fact that there are hundreds of thousands, if not now millions, of those kinds of weapons floating through the United States. I'll make a note. There are more weapons, there are more guns in the United States than there are people. And that is a challenge that we confront as a people. Now, I'm a gun owner. I have fired AR-15 style rifles. They're very fun to shoot. But the question is, if I can have one, so too can a 14-year-old dealing with some kind of mental health challenge or some narcissistic, nihilist that wants to go down in a blaze of glory. They can get an access to such weapons as well. And so, why am I talking about this? Well, federalism is one of the things that kind of stands in the way of us doing anything about these kinds of weapons. And part of it, a lot of people say the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, as it's interpreted, says that individuals have a right to a gun. The 16th Amendment, as it was written, was designed for militias to be formed by state governments. That was one of the ways that the delegates, or that the Federalists were mollifying the Anti-Federalists, and especially those people who were slaveholders. So it's challenging to me to know that, and I just want to pose this to the audience. People have excoriated the lockdowns that took place during COVID-19. And one of the things that they raise is the damage that was done to children's education. Well, imagine as a child today, you're going to school, and there is the possibility that someone's going to come on your campus and kill a bunch of people, and maybe you. What kind of damage does that do to our educational system? That kids are oftentimes going to school in a state of terror or resignation that they just may have to experience an event like the children, like the young people at Appalachia High School experienced, or the children at Sandy Hook Elementary School. What kind of psychic damage is done to children who directly confront that? And how does that damage reverberate out throughout the country? And ask yourself, is there literally nothing we can do to make our schools safer? That is an issue that again, people say it's not a time for politics. Well, guess what? There's never a time for politics when there's multiple school shootings every year. So to me, this is a very, very challenging issue. I do believe in the Second Amendment. I own, 2 guns myself, and I think that people should have a right to guns. I don't think that people should have, that the access should be so unregulated that children can get guns and kill themselves or kill other people. There was recently, an arrest of an 11-year-old who killed his grandparents. Again, there should be consequences for people who will leave their guns laying around so that unsupervised, so that people with mental health issues can get access to them. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. So our main topic for today is that federalism is as important as ever. Now, again, it's important largely, again, because state and local governments are semi-autonomous actors. They are in a position to interpret what people want to do nationally and to try to adopt local solutions to those kinds of problems. Okay, so controversies over the appropriate role of each level of government, national, state, and local, are continuing and intensifying in contemporary politics. And to some extent, this reflects the growing polarization of our politics in America, where, again, conservatives are convinced not only that liberals are mistaken, but that they are wrong and even acting in bad faith, and that suspicion and animus is held in return by liberals. So, under which conditions do liberals prefer national solutions to allowing the states to act as laboratories of democracy? Again, that's one of the main advantages, right, of federalism, that you allow states to experiment with certain policies. For example, historically, Wisconsin has been looked at as sort of an education entrepreneur. They have done more to ensure that local school districts have the resources that they need. They distribute more money to local schools than any other state. And one of the reasons why Wisconsin is typically top 5 in education is because of those resources that are made available for education. Likewise, in Iowa, they have this idea of master teachers, people who have both experience and long records of teaching excellence. Those folks are paid more, and they're encouraged to visit other classrooms and to work with other teachers. And one thing we've learned in education is that multiple adults in the classroom is a good thing. It helps do that first thing that you have to do before you can teach, which is assert control over the classroom. So under what conditions do conservatives prefer to impose national solutions over state solutions? It's important to recognize that the issues that partisans care about the most are the ones they tend to want to impose a uniform policy over nationally. While partisans on both sides are more willing to allow state or local governments to experiment on issues that are less central to their ideological projects. And when you think about, for example, the issue of abortion, which is a major issue in this upcoming election, it reflects the reality that people within the Republican Party they don't want people to have the freedom to terminate pregnancies in California. They want California to be under the same rule because they are convinced that abortion is murder. The same thing is true on the other side. Liberals want a national protection of women's reproductive rights because they believe that is an essential right. That without it, women are diminished politically, okay, and reduced to second-class citizenship. And so, the one thing you'll learn over the course of studying American government is that partisans on both sides tend to give lip service to federalism as a principle, but they're perfectly willing to set it aside when they really care about an issue. States' rights is an important, it's a historical kind of argument. It emerged in the early 19th century. The origins of the principle of state rights kind of come from the 10th Amendment, which contains the Reserved Powers Clause. In the early 19th century, you had this idea, this doctrine promulgated of nullification, which is an extreme version of states' rights that rose in popularity in the early 1830s, resulting from sectional tensions between northern and southern states over sort of interrelated issues of slavery and tariffs. Okay, tariffs again are taxes on imported goods and services. And the slave states were primarily exporting goods. And so they were affected adversely from an economic perspective by tariffs. And the primary architect of the doctrine of nullification was a guy by the name of John C. Calhoun, who was a South Carolina slave owner. He was an avowed white supremacist who served as Secretary of War under James Monroe, and also served as Vice President under two presidents, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. He was the most recent person to serve as Vice President under two different presidents. The doctrine of nullification was justified by Calhoun with his arguments about what he conceived as concurrent majorities. And that suggests that the states were under no obligation to obey federal laws that a state's leaders believed to violate or exceed the federal government's constitutional authority. So in the 19th century, the Supreme Court very frequently used the 10th Amendment to strike down laws. And of course, the Civil War also again kind of rewrote, led to this fundamental revision of the Constitution. When you think of those three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, you should also recognize that in writing out those amendments and getting them ratified, it fundamentally overwrote portions of the Constitution. For example, the 13th Amendment, basically banning all forms of involuntary servitude, effectively renders null that portion of Article 4 that talks about the rendition of slaves. Okay, it just makes it go away, right? It's like a strike through. And so, from the post-Civil War era, again, you still had very conservative people on the Supreme Court interpreting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in very narrow ways, and states' rights remained sort of in effect, well into the 1930s. However, really beginning in the 1920s, the Supreme Court began to look at those revisions of the Constitution in fundamentally novel, new ways, and began dramatically expanding federal power. Now, why was federal power being expanded? And a lot of times we think of revision as a bad thing. In this instance, I don't think it was. What was happening was the federal government, really going all the way back to the late 19th century, was reckoning with the realities of industrialization. The United States was undergoing tremendous changes as a result of the enormous expansion of American industry. And you know, think about what was happening. The intercontinental railroads were being built. Massive amounts of steel were being produced, both to, you know, build the railroads, but also to build you know, larger cities, because many people were moving into cities because they were finding work in factories. There were more and more jobs in these large cities. And so, you know, industrialization typically begets urbanization. And what is urbanization but lots and lots of people living in cities? And the thing about cities, a population that is widely dispersed and living on land where they can grow food are much more self-sufficient. They can grow hemp and literally create their own clothing. When you move into a city, you no longer have that ability to grow your own food or to make your own clothing. So what is happening? Urbanization is not only, you know, making people have to get food that's produced. They're also having to get clothing. So you're seeing these big, you know, stores that sell clothing emerge in this period. Okay, and so it's a fundamentally new way of living, and as a result, it's a fundamentally new way of governing. I have a kind of law of politics that I oftentimes talk about in all my classes. And that law is, and it's not really a law, but it's a strong correlation. More government or more people equals more government. The more densely populated an area is, that was my dyslexia raising up there. The more people are living in a given area, the more densely populated an area, the more you need government to regulate conduct. Okay? That is simply what I have observed over, you know, 30 years, you know, teaching. And it's hard, you know, it's hard to get away from that reality. So one thing that began happening, especially in the 40s and into the 1950s, remember what's happening in the 1950s? You're beginning to see the federal government responding to civil rights. Okay. Now, again, how did this happen? Well, FDR, remember, FDR did not want to really directly address issues related to race because he needed the votes of Southern Democrats in order to win elections. And so he basically made a deal with these, what we call bourbon Democrats. I won't use the federal government to, you know, to regulate the way you treat your black citizens, and you'll continue supporting me, and we'll continue governing in areas where we can govern. Okay? And so, but what is also changing is that FDR is he's loading the court. Remember, FDR is president from 1932 until 1944, right? That is actually 33 until 44. That is a long period of being president. He literally got to he didn't replace everybody on the Supreme Court, but he made 9 appointments to the Supreme Court. In some instances, he replaced people more than once, okay, where people died or retired. And he literally remade the federal judiciary through the appointment process. And many of those folks were what we would call economic liberals in terms of their jurisprudence. They accepted the federal government had a more active role to play in this new economic reality. And many of those judges were also racial liberals. They believed in equality. They were civil rights liberals. They believed that people should not be subject to discrimination. And so over that period of time, federal judges began making rulings that were adversely affecting the ability of these white Southern Democrats to, you know, discriminate and exploit their black citizens for their labor. So the Southern Manifesto was ultimately a reaction against those movements, you know, in civil rights by Southern whites. And the Southern Manifesto was actually a 1956 declaration signed by 96 Southern members of Congress that said that the Southern states weren't constitutionally bound by Supreme Court decisions banning segregation. Now, this was obviously a reaction to the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. Now, ultimately, Brown would issue what was known as Brown 2, and then another decision where all 9 justices signed onto it and basically said that you can't swear an oath to the Constitution and then not uphold, acts of the Supreme, rulings of the Supreme Court. So the one thing that had happened since the Civil War and since the ratification of the 13th Amendment was that following Reconstruction, Southern white political elites were very successful and effective at reducing blacks, basically eliminating their civil rights, eliminating their capacity to vote, their ability to vote, and subordinating them as second-class citizens. And we'll learn more about this when we get to our discussion of civil rights. So the Southern states were very successful at maintaining what was known as Jim Crow in the South. In most Southern states, as blacks integrated the schools, what happened? Well, white parents who could afford moved their children into private schools, often named after Confederate war heroes. There were a bunch of private schools named Robert E. Lee Elementary or Robert E. Lee High School. I played a football game against a school in Alabama like that. And again, those sorts of private, that movement to private schools proliferated throughout the states of the former Confederacy. And the practical effect was that Southern states just basically did the minimum for public schools. They basically just let them, kind of crumble and just didn't invest in public education at all. Okay? And so ultimately the challenge here is that civil rights was successful. And states' rights as a slogan became, basically tainted with this idea of white supremacy, okay, for a long period of time. However, it began reemerging. And of course, today, I think there are a lot of people that make their, arguments about federalism in terms of states' rights. So, again, for much of the 20th century, you saw this dramatic expansion of the power of the federal government. And conservative academics and constitutional scholars began making the argument in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. A lot of the experts on federalism that wrote in that period were ideologically conservative. And they began arguing for a reinvigoration of state sovereignty and state rights based on 10th Amendment interpretations in the early 1980s. Many American government textbooks argue that conservatives of that era were worried about the growing power of the federal government, which threatened to encroach on individual liberties. Two more obvious concerns were clearly connected to conservative states' rights movements: the growing regulatory capacity of the federal government to intervene in industries engaged in activities that were polluting the environment, and the increasing willingness of the Justice Department to enforce civil rights laws banning discrimination against blacks, Hispanics, and other members of minority communities. So the conservatives basically had a moment of resurgence in the 1980s, kind of correlated strongly with Ronald Reagan's dramatic victory in 1980. And Reagan, in his inaugural address, basically made the argument, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And his administration was dedicated to the idea of devolution, of returning more and more responsibility for governing to state governments. And that basically the argument was, we want to rebalance the authority between the federal government and the state governments. The first time the Supreme Court actually had a ruling since the New Deal, that used federalism to limit Congress's legislative authority occurred in the case United States versus Lopez. And unsurprisingly, it dealt with a gun issue. Congress passed the Gun-Free Zones Act of 1990, which involved Congress invoking its commerce regulating authority to ban unauthorized individuals from knowingly possessing a loaded or unsecured firearm at a place a reasonable person would know was a school zone. Alfonso Lopez was a 12th grade student at a high school in San Antonio, Texas, who brought an unloaded .38 caliber revolver to his high school along with some cartridges. School officials were alerted to his possession of the gun, and he was subsequently arrested and charged. He was tried and convicted, and his case was appealed to the Supreme Court, ultimately, which held by a narrow 5-4 majority that the Gun-Free Zones Act was unconstitutional because Congress's power to regulate commerce did not extend to the regulation or carrying of handguns. And so again, many of the dissents in that case basically said, guns are products, guns are manufactured, guns are made in a factory and shipped some places, oftentimes outside of states. Of course it involves commerce, but nevertheless, again, this was something that triggered something kind of primordial among conservatives, okay? So state control over national policies, is one of the things that oftentimes is happening, is that we begin recognizing returning responsibility to state governments without giving state governments the capacity to fund those responsibilities simply mean that those responsibilities are not met. Okay, so you begin seeing a rethinking of federalism in a lot of conservative think tanks in the latter part of the 20th century. Now, let me explain what a think tank is. Think tanks are something we'll discuss at later points in the semester, particularly when we get to our discussion of interest groups. But for now, we'll think about think tanks as institutions that hire policy experts to study issues and formulate policies from a particular political or ideological perspective. They're often described as administrations in waiting, where policy experts attached to one party that might be out of power produce papers in order to appeal to voters for support in future elections. Many of the top conservative think tanks of the 1970s emerged in reaction to that long period of democratic dominance of the federal government, stretching back again from the 1930s to the late 1960s. Especially those New Deal programs like the Social Security and Great Society programs like Medicare and Medicaid. To illustrate, the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the main conservative think tanks, was founded in 1973. Likewise, the Cato Institution, which is a libertarian-oriented group, was founded in 1977. So in addition to conducting research that are basically attacking welfare programs, these groups have committed enormous resources to attacking regulatory policies and to advocating and trying to formulate free market alternatives to regulatory policies. So one of the things that emerged in this period of kind of federalism, of regulated federalism, or now new federalism, is are two ideas: devolution and block grants. Now, devolution can be described as policies that remove a program from one level of government by delegating it to a lower level of government, in particular from the national government to the state levels. Similarly, block grants are a form of grant where the federal government sends money with no strings attached, and states can spend the money however they want so long as the money goes to the broad purpose for which it was issued, like, for example, education or health care. Block grants sound good for the states, but one thing that tends to happen over time is that Congress begins to steadily reduce the amount of money being appropriated to keep those programs adequately funding, which shifts more and more of the responsibility onto the states to actually fund them. So keep in mind, when you only appropriate the same amount of money from year to year, inflation typically means that the funding program is falling, steadily falling below, the previous monetary value. So new federalism emerges again, and it's related both to the Nixon and the Reagan administrations, both of them Republican, administrations, as a conservative approach to intergovernmental relations. Both the Nixon and Reagan administrations advanced versions of new federalism, which called for the return of power from the federal government to the states. The challenge with new federalism is that, again, if you return power without financial resources, what do you get? Some of the wealthiest states might be able to approach the levels of funding necessary, but even the biggest, wealthiest states like California and Texas oftentimes fall short, leaving critical programs, chronically underfunded. Think about it from the perspective of Oklahoma. Kevin Stitt has come into power saying that Oklahoma needs to be a top 10 state. Now, but what he has typically meant was we should be a top 10 state economically. We should be doing things to make Oklahoma as business friendly as possible. So he has advocated tax cuts. He has advocated reducing the size and scope of government. Well, what happens to the big things that government at the state level do? Health care. What happens to education, which is a major state responsibility? What happens to management of state prisons? What happens to mental health facilities? All of these things go down. And of course, Stitt recently said he never expected Oklahoma to be a top 10 state in education. Ask yourself why he believes that. One other thing to talk about is the idea, there was a brief experiment really, which was, the idea was promulgated during the Johnson administration in the, from 64 to 68. It was called General Revenue Sharing, GRS. That was an innovative approach to fiscal federalism, proposed by the Johnson administration in the 1960s and adopted during the Nixon administration. GRS involved the federal government using tax revenue from the federal level to supplement the budgets of state governments according to an established formula. GRS was wildly popular with state government officials because it gave states money without them having to raise taxes. GRS was in operation for 14 years from 1972 until 1986, when Congress abolished it. Now, ask yourself, why did Congress abolish general revenue sharing? Unsurprisingly, members of Congress didn't like it because it bypassed them in terms of getting revenues back to their districts. They didn't get to claim credit that they would get otherwise through the normal, pork barrel politics that goes on within Congress. And so they didn't like it because it robbed them of that ability to say, look at all this money I have gotten for my state or for my district. Another aspect of federalism that we need to talk about is this challenge of what are known as unfunded mandate. Now again, the argument for returning power to the states is this idea that states will act as laboratories of democracy. That's actually something that a Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, came up with in the early 20th centuries. An example is California's 1995 ban on smoking in enclosed workplaces. That illustrates how an innovation in one state can be rapidly emulated in other states. You can also look at Massachusetts' adoption of nearly universal health care legislation that became the template of the Affordable Care Act of 2010 at the federal level. I can also throw out one other example. The state of Wisconsin mandated that all states all cars sold within the state of Wisconsin had to include seat belts. It was that example and the sharp reduction of fatalities in Wisconsin that led to the adoption of of Congress basically saying to the automotive industry, you have to include safety belts, seat belts, in the manufacturing process of all vehicles. Okay, so the dark side of federalism, though, is this: if states can act as laboratories of democracy, can they not also act as laboratories of tyranny? In this instance, a state determined to deny rights to citizens may adopt innovative approaches to policies that legally discriminate against some of its citizens, and that policy is rapidly diffused to other state governments who have similar desires. Strict voter identification laws, which have the effect of restricting the voting rights of young, low-income, and oftentimes elderly Americans, rapidly spread throughout states whose groups were identified as most likely to vote against the party in power in those states. Likewise, prior to the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022 or 2023, that asserted that again the states' rights, women's rights to end an unwanted pregnancy. States began passing laws that mandated abortion clinics had to have admitting rights to hospitals, which is again. In Republican-dominated states, hospitals routinely denied admitting rights to abortion clinics in states like Mississippi. So again, you have a major source of tension, which is this idea of unfunded mandates. And these are situations where Congress passes a law or regulation that requires a state to perform certain actions, but doesn't provide funding to actually undertake the action. There are a lot of examples of unfunded mandates, including the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. Think about the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you're a small municipal government and you don't have ramps on all your sidewalks, if it's all curb, and that limits the ability of people in wheelchairs to move around. Here at Rogers State University, we have to have ramps up all stairwells, all places going into buildings, and we also have to have elevators in all of our buildings, some of which were built very early in the 20th century. Okay, so that requires Rogers State University to install elevators in all of our buildings. When you think about it, Prep Hall was built it was built before 1920. Think about the challenges of introducing an elevator, into a 3-story building that was built that long ago. So another issue here is you get the mingling of federal and state implementation responsibilities that creates what in policy terms we call accountability problems. So an example of coordination and/or accountability problems is the Temporary Aid to Needy Families, TANF, which replaced the Federal Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, in 1996. It created a block grant for states to provide their own welfare programs. Some states, like Minnesota, created incentives for families to take on low-wage jobs. On the other hand, several other states imposed very strict limits on how long families could receive benefits. The result was that those states provided very different levels of aid, and overall the number of people on welfare dramatically decreased. However, it didn't eliminate poverty and left many low-income Americans in those kind of resource-poor states with fewer options, particularly on single mothers, one of the most vulnerable of low-income groups. When you think about low-income groups, think about a 19-year-old woman who is not married and has 2 kids. What are her job prospects? That's a serious obstacle. Can you get a job at 19 where you probably don't have a very good education, even if you did get a high school education or a GED? Can you get a job that will enable you to afford child care for 2 kids? That's a big problem, and it's a problem that we're still struggling to address. So there are federal-state tensions in 3 broad areas, and there's more than that, but these are just really good examples. During the Bush and Obama administration's 2008 crackdown on undocumented immigration, again, the Bush administration passed the Secure Community programs, which Obama actually expanded when he came into office. And that required state and local governments to check the fingerprints of people being booked into jail against a Department of Homeland Security database. That led to an unprecedented number of deportations in the years 2009, 2010. Ironically, Obama's first 2 years of office, which resulted in several states pulling out of the program on the grounds that many undocumented immigrants were being deported that had committed no crimes. They'd simply been accused but weren't actually guilty of anything. So part of the reasons why people backed out, why local officials backed out of the program, is that major employers in those areas were being harmed by the lack of undocumented labor. As President Trump exploited Americans' fears about undocumented immigrants to an unprecedented degree, promising to build a wall and to make Mexico pay for it. He also promised to crack down on sanctuary cities whose these were metropolitan areas that refused to cooperate with federal programs rounding up undocumented immigrants. Now, what's a good example of a sanctuary city? Some of the larger urban cities that are in Democratic states, like for example Illinois and Chicago, with Chicago, or Los Angeles with California. Those are examples of sanctuary cities where, again, what makes them a sanctuary city? There are enormous Latino populations already in the existing communities in those cities. So undocumented immigrants going into those cities are finding language groups where they can blend in and find work. Likewise, New York City was kind of viewed as a sanctuary city. In 2019, a federal appeals court held that the Trump administration could withhold grants from the Community-Oriented Policing Services, known as the COPS program, a Clinton-era program. They could withhold those grants from sanctuary cities. Now, Biden reversed those Trump-era immigration policies, and Trump is promising even more dramatic crackdowns on undocumented immigrants, including mass roundups and deportations. Now, think about what you would have to do. Now, he said he's going to get all 12 to 15 million undocumented immigrants and promptly deport them. Think about the manpower that you would have to raise and train in order to apprehend 12 to 15 million people. Think about, any attempt to use the military would be legally problematic. So you would have to dramatically expand probably some agent or create an agency within Homeland Security. And then again, for every person you're apprehending, you're then going to have to find a place to put them until you can get them back to their country of origin. You have to make sure you are actually getting them back to their country of origin, because if you don't, again, you are creating legal liabilities for the federal government in the way they are implementing that program. You would have to have mass detention centers holding hundreds of thousands of people in several states in order to make that kind of policy work. And then you would have to ship them back to those countries of origin. Now imagine what kind of destabilizing effects there's going to be when you plop hundreds of thousands of people back in Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela, and elsewhere. So we would be increasing the problems of countries south of the border, increasing anti-American sentiment, Plus, you would be creating a process that would be rife with abuse, potential for abuse, I should say. It is, in military terms, highly impracticable to say that Donald Trump could do what he is claiming that he thinks he can do. Another issue is the federal government's tolerance of states' experimentation with marijuana legalization. Federal authority to regulate marijuana has been upheld in several courts. However, despite a 2005 Supreme Court decision upholding the right of Congress to ban medical marijuana, 11 states, including Oklahoma, have subsequently legalized its use for medical purposes. And it seems like 90% of the people of Oklahoma all have a recreational marijuana card. And so by 2022, there are 37 states, plus the District of Columbia, that have legalized medical marijuana. And in 2006, Colorado legalized the recreational use of marijuana. And for Colorado, again, it comes with both benefits and costs. One benefit is it's an enormous revenue source of revenue because Colorado is taxing the manufacture and sale of recreational marijuana. And people are traveling to Colorado. I mean, people have always traveled to Colorado for the skiing. Now they're going for the pot. And so, it's becoming much more of a destination spot than it was in the past. So here's a couple of interesting slides that kind of show you, important things related to where federal spending comes from. When you look at, federal grants to state and local government based on 2022 estimates, $618 billion of federal funds are going back to the states for health care. $195 billion was going on income security programs, unemployment insurance and things like that. $101 billion was going to transportation. Now that's a fairly durable number. A lot of these other things are largely, I would argue, COVID related. $107 billion are going to states for education. And then there's just a variety of kind of miscellaneous things. Almost $200 billion are going to the states. Now again, what does that tell you? It says on the one hand, state governments are really dependent on the federal government in certain important issue areas. And health and transportation are two of those areas where state governments really need that federal supplement in order to do what they need to do appropriately. Who benefits from federal spending? When you look at this map, take a look at it. The people in the dark blue, these are beneficiaries. They're getting more from the federal government than their tax dollars are going out to the federal government. So look at some of these states: Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia. A lot of that has to do with the presence of large military institutions. New Mexico. When you look at some of these states, some of these lower income states, they're actually not. They're not, or actually these are high income states: California, New York, Minnesota. These are states, Colorado again, Utah. These are states where more money is going out to the federal government than is coming in. So the taxpayers of those states are actually, sending out money to benefit these these lower income impoverished states. Okay, so federalism, and it's important to keep in mind, all governments have something like redistribution involved with them. Governments tax and then they spend. They take money from some people and then they do things that are supposed to benefit the common good. Now, all too often we tend to look at these things in zero-sum terms. I see a lot of memes on social media. You know, I paid my student loans. Why should I pay for someone else's student loans? First and foremost, you're not. The federal government forgiving loans is not actually costing taxpayers any money. What it is costing are certain banking institutions that have involved themselves in student loan processing, and it is reducing their revenues. So if you're if you're a CEO of a bank of one of those institutions, then you are probably being negatively impacted by the Biden administration's forgiveness of student loans. But if you're a blue-collar person that went to college and paid, you know, you took out a couple $1,000s in student loans and then ultimately paid it off, you're not being affected by one penny. Okay? It's not a zero-sum situation. And in fact, I think there is an argument, and I think it's a legitimate argument to be said, that reducing poverty is sort of a rising tide that lifts all boats kind of situation. When you lift people out of poverty, you are enabling them to autonomously get by through their lives without having to rely on any kind of federal programs. That reducing dependence on federal programs reduces the level of money that needs to be committed to those programs and to the state programs as well. The more people that are lifted out of poverty, they also become taxpayers. That potentially reduces the overall tax burden on everybody else. So I would say that things like investing in education, investing in anti-poverty programs, figuring out programs to address homelessness, which is a major issue in the United States in a lot of major metropolitan areas, including in red states like here in Tulsa. Tulsa, Oklahoma City have significant homelessness issues. Those are valuable investments. Going back to marijuana, these are the states that have legalized, as of 2022, they've legalized recreational and medical marijuana. Look at all the states: Montana, all the coastal states, Nevada, Alaska, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. Think about Montana doing it. Missouri, Illinois, Minnesota, Virginia. Many of the northeastern states, those states that where it's only for medical use, include Oklahoma. Now there is, I believe, a ballot for recreational. Well, there was a ballot for recreational use that failed. That probably isn't going to go away. But again, it reflects sort of the culture wars, right? It's not ironic that it was an Oklahoman, Merle Haggard, that wrote an Okie from Muskogee, and the first line of the song is, "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee, but we do take medical marijuana," right? Again, there are also enormous tensions, and this also reflects the culture war over the issue of abortion. The issue of women's reproductive rights, including the right to terminate an unwanted or unviable pregnancy, was established in 1973 in the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade. In 2022, the Supreme Court, by a 6-3 majority, overturned the Roe precedent. While the decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Services didn't outlaw abortion outright, it left it to the states to regulate abortions. To date, 13 states have passed total or near total bans on the procedure, with other states seeking to ban the procedure. And other states are seeking to protect reproductive rights of women. In Missouri, for example, legislation was proposed that would penalize state residents who traveled outside Missouri to procure an abortion. Some anti-abortion state attorneys generals are currently suing the Biden administration's use of federal records privacy laws to prevent states from subpoenaing medical records in states, again, that allow abortions, to prosecute women from states, again, who travel outside of their states to get abortions. That is, again, another major source of federal and state conflict. And so again, Oklahoma is one of those states that has a near total ban. And think about it, if you are living in Central Texas, how far do you have to travel to get to a state where you might have, where you might be able to end a pregnancy? And this is a problem for many women who want to have a child, who find themselves, dealing with an ectopic pregnancy, where again the pregnancy, the fertilization occurs outside of the uterus, and with premature rupturing of the placental cord, RPROM, which happens unfortunately very frequently. And again, in many instances, hospitals, because of their fear of prosecution, are simply not doing things that even the law might allow, simply because they are fearful that they will be prosecuted by overzealous attorneys generals trying to make a name for themselves. And so this has created a horrible situation for women's reproductive health. And I believe it has set back women's reproductive health by decades. So again, political polarization has exacerbated state and local tensions as well. Oftentimes state governments have demonstrated a willingness to preempt local policies. In case you haven't encountered that word, preemption. When discussed related to public policy, it refers to the principle that empowers a national government to override a state or local action in certain policy areas. It also applies within the context of federalism to state governments overriding local actions or policies. It has another meaning, which refers to the willingness of one country to strike another country first in the belief that the other country was planning a hostile action. Please don't get those two meanings mixed up. So state governments often engage in preemption when local governments' policy preferences diverge from dominant economic state interests. So here in Oklahoma, it's been municipal ordinances banning hydraulic fracturing, otherwise known as fracking, within city limits, as well as municipal attempts to raise the minimum wage that have been subject to preemption or threats of preemption. In some areas, local regulation of car or home sharing businesses like Lyft or Uber or Airbnb have sparked state and local tensions. Another area of conflict have been gender-based discrimination in public facilities, otherwise, bathrooms, where some municipal governments have attempted to establish, likewise, another issue related to state and local tensions are broadband services, which again has drawn the ire of state governments. Regulation of firearms is one of the most contentious of state and local issues. Several state governments have enacted preemptive legislation on local ordinances restricting gun ownership within city limits. At the same time, 6 states, Colorado, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Hawaii, recently repealed preemption laws that cleared local government to reinstate local gun control ordinances. And of course, the Supreme Court has recently held that any attempt to restrict the possession of firearms has to have some sort of historical precedent within a community, which is a pretty kind of odd way of doing things. So what do we think? Many of America's fiercest political conflicts have revolved over questions directly involving federalism. Americans generally accept the idea that states should have the freedom to enact policies that best serve their interests. However, some variations across state boundaries are undesirable from a policy perspective. In many instances, you want to have, if there is a uniform policy that works and works in many local contexts, that's where you really want to try to ensure that a more uniform policy is in place. Businesses oftentimes want a more uniform. They want the federal government to regulate rather than the state, and they want the state government to be regulating rather than local governments. So there are perennial issues. In what ways Does federalism reflect struggles over power and political ideas, ideology, for example? And again, the answer to that is in many, many issue areas. You see, how people think about issues directly impact, how they interpret federalism. Is it fair that a transgender person in California can legally change their sex on their birth certificate, but a transgender person in Tennessee cannot? Does that encourage the movement of people within those communities, within the parents of transgender children in Tennessee? If they have if both parents have agreed that that hormone blockers and maybe transitioning a child to a gender that the child is more comfortable with, if they're not allowed to do that in that state, is that going to encourage them to move to a state where it is allowed? That's causing people to uproot and to, where they might really want to live in that community, but where that community's, again, interpretation of fundamental things like transgender care, is perceived by them as discriminatory or exclusive. Is it reasonable that a gun owner can openly carry a handgun in Georgia, but not in Florida? Ask the people in Winder, Georgia. Again, open carry, oftentimes you make the argument that the more people that are openly carrying guns, the less crime there will be. I think history is demonstrating that that's simply not true. More guns, the more people are running around with guns, the more we're seeing impulsive violence. Road rage that turns into a gunfight, where before all you had was, a hand gesture. Now you've got people with guns engaging in gun battles on the nation's highways because, poor anger management. Is it fair that voters in some states can use drive-through voting, but not in Texas? Again, this reflects this belief that some states think. State political office holders think that less voting is better for them. And is that good for democracy when people in power think that it's in their interests to make it harder for people to vote? Is that something that we should allow people to experiment with the idea of laboratories of tyranny? Or should we be making sure that all American citizens have access to the ballot? Everybody says, well, that will mean that undocumented immigrants can vote. There's no way. In order for an undocumented immigrant to try to vote, first of all, they would have to register to vote, and they would have to lie on the form, which is a felony. And getting caught is a serious crime. So that's simply not a viable argument for making, for trying to make it sure. Trying to make sure that more people have the ability to vote. In my view, as a political scientist, having done this job for close to 30 years, I believe that how many people vote in elections is an important indicator of the legitimacy of that government. That consistently Oklahoma ranks near the bottom in voter turnout, despite the fact that we make it easy to vote, is really a problem to me. So let's do some questions. Is one party more consistent when it comes to federalism? The answer to that, if you've heard the last two presentations, the answer is no. Nobody is consistent. They look at federalism strategically and tactically. When they really care about an issue, they want that issue to be dealt with via national policy. They want that issue to be nationalized. Both parties want a national solution to abortion. Pro-choice people, liberals, want women to have access to abortion in every state. Pro-life people want abortion to be illegal in every state. Okay, so consistency is not part of how we do things in this country as it relates to issues that really ignite these kinds of creedal passions that oftentimes have religious implications associated with them. Here's another question. Given the fact that the federal government is paralyzed by partisan gridlock, why not allow the states to protect their own borders the way Texas has been doing? And I think the answer to that is because what Texas is doing is probably, in some instances, violating human rights of international treaties that America is a signatory to. Creating buoys across the Rio Grande River has caused people to drown. It's demonstrated that it is a hazard and that it's also making it more difficult for federal border patrol agencies to do their job. And Texas is actively impeding the border control from doing their job. If the Constitution means something, and if rule of law means something, then Article 6's Supremacy Clause means something. And that means that the national government should be dealing with immigration. The Senate passed a bill that would have dramatically strengthened border protections. It was the strongest bill, immigration-related legislation that had been proposed in my lifetime. And it didn't pass because Republicans preferred to campaign on the issue rather than govern. And that really is a damning condemnation of how hyperpartisanship is affecting our politics. Last question. Is the American approach to federalism unique? Do other countries that use federalism do it differently? The answer to that is yes. Germany practices federalism quite differently. Australia does it quite differently. They have similar kind of electoral processes where local elections oftentimes have significant implications for national elections, but they're almost separate kinds of events. And Germany actually exercises something known as executive federalism, and the states, the lagers, do not have the capacity to resist that American state governments do. Most states practice federalism in ways where, and again, a lot of these states are parliamentary systems as well. Most states that practice federalism in a little bit less autonomous way than the United States. So that's our discussion of federalism. I know it's a very difficult topic to wrap your head around, and again, you have to study this issue because federalism is a moving target. And it's one of the things that complicates being an American citizen, in that, again, the meaning of federalism has evolved considerably over time. When we come back, we will take another look at federalism from the bottom up, looking at state and local politics and government. I'll see you next time.